Good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Just so you know, I'm not a caribou biologist, so I won't go into many details, but I'll try to lay out the ground for further discussion later on today. Okay, so Peary Caribou and the Dolphin and Union Caribou are, like mentioned, two of the northernmost caribou population in North America anyway. And just in case I get mixed up, I will use DU for the designatable units because it's harder to say in French for a French guy. And Dolphin and Union Caribou, I'll try to spell it the full name every time so there's no confusion. So those are the distribution of the two groups. Peary Caribou in pink here, all the Arctic islands and a little bit of the mainland, and then the Dolphin and Union between Victoria Island and the mainland just south of it. And I'll start with the Peary Caribou status and trend, and it's probably no news for most of you who's interested in caribou. Peary Caribou from numbers that were historically estimated in the order of 40 to 50,000 animals have gone down over the past decades, and currently the trend is unknown, and you can see I put a lot of question marks and question marks on the graph because actually the NWT research team just brought back some good news for some of those islands, for Melville Island and Prince Patrick, where apparently the number of caribou there has increased over the past 14 years. And there's a poster that you can look at for the results of this. And the same on the Nunavut side, there's quite a bit of difference depending on the islands you look at, and so although the overall status is still probably a fairly low population, there may be some hope, at least in some areas, that they have started to recover. And this is consistent also with local knowledge and communities mentioning some areas where caribou have been increasing. So still some concern, but there's some hope there. For the Dolphin and Union Caribou, I put it as a point, but not in the graph. Like there's report of up to 100,000 animals, and it's very rough figure, and I'm not completely certain of that number, but anyway, at the point there were way more caribou on Victoria Island and migrating for the winter to the mainland. And the current estimate, and you can see on the graph, there's two trend lines with two sets of estimates for the same year. And this is because the lower estimate, except for here where we didn't apply a correction, but for here, and here, there's an acknowledgement that the survey area was not comprehensive enough to include all the animals from that herd. So we attempted to correct that with the available color data and provide a corrected estimate that is felt to better represent the current abundance of that herd and past abundance. But you can see that in the trend doesn't change whether you use one estimate or the other. So currently we assess the trend as stable because the confidence interval doesn't allow to have any significant result in terms of showing a decline, but it's stable at best because graphically you can see that well, it hasn't increased for sure. Now, the significance of those units, of those two types of caribou, well, there's some genetic differentiation that, I mean, they are part of the original refugium, of the Berrichian refugium, and there was some differentiation and isolation and bottleneck that made them genetically identifiable, and both are adapted to the extreme cold. Like it's one of the coldest area probably to live in year-round, and with relatively limited productivity or vegetation availability. It's pretty barren in those areas. And one thing that makes them significant as well is that for a few Inuit communities, those are the only two populations that are accessible for food and skins and other byproducts, and they are unique to Canada, like they are our own. For the DU1, like I mentioned, there's a genetic differentiation. There's a distinct phenotype there. You can recognize Peary Caribou fairly easily, just how they look like. One important feature is the inter-island movement, and I'll come back to it a little bit with the stressors. Is that, well, this, like I said, I'm not a caribou expert, but from my understanding, it's likely more or less a meta-population among all those islands, and there's a series of extinction, recolonization that has happened over time, and if you cut those corridors between islands, you're likely to encounter more isolation and potential problems in the future. So in the stressors, like I mentioned, there's the ice, but there's also one of the big stressors that is identified as the weather, and whether it's linked to climate change, and we can discuss it a little bit later on, or not, but dramatic and stochastic weather events have been identified as potentially one of the main stressors for those population of Peary Caribou, and especially icing events, for example, that cover the ground and make the food very hard to get at. And predation is one potential stressor. Competition with muskox, it's not necessarily a direct competition for food, but there's several aspects of the two species being in the sympatric that could be negative to caribou. From traditional knowledge, like muskox tend to spoil a little bit the ground and potentially destroy some of the food available for caribou. That's one thing. But one thing that is very likely also is that muskox are able to maintain a local population of predators. And when muskox populations are high, they can actually help sustaining a high predator population in the area. And caribou could be more vulnerable to those predators. And then there's the human factor. Harvest. Oh, sorry. I had to do it once at least. Harvest is probably currently not a huge factor because it has decreased quite a bit. NWT communities have taken quite some proactive action to try to reduce the harvest on Peary Caribou, and Nunavut, the communities have realized that well, need to be careful, and the current harvest, there's been some local management plan, even if they were not official, but to try to reduce the harvest, that the communities did that on their own with the help of the government to try to reduce the harvest. So harvest is probably currently not a huge factor, but it's something to monitor because it could add to the other factors. One of the worries, and we heard it earlier in previous presentation, is that, well, caribou need habitat, and land use is one of the things that potentially reduce that habitat. So there's quite a bit of coal potential in the Arctic, plus the oil and gas, and all this development in the north also imply maritime traffic, and with the shrinking of the sea ice, it allows more potential for maritime traffic, and of course companies tend to want to push the season to the maximum, which can include ice breaking. And like I mentioned, I mean, those corridors of ice between islands can be key for the survival of some of those populations, so it's another thing of concern. And of course the climate change issue with the shrinking of the ice and the more unpredictable how the ice will form from one year to the other around those islands is of concern. For the Dolphin and Union Caribou, again, this is one of the most differentiated of the barren ground caribou. There's some discussion about classification of that herd based on genetic and other factors. So far, to my knowledge, it's still a barren ground caribou, but it might be mainly the fact that they reach a very drastic bottleneck, and if they were different prior to that bottleneck, after the bottleneck, they probably had a little bit of mixing with the mainland caribou, and it could be why they're not that different from the barren ground caribou genetically. But one of the key features of that herd is that it migrates every year between Victoria Island and the mainland. And so this is a migratory herd that use the sea ice as their main corridor to reach, to access their winter ground in the fall and to go back to their calving areas in the summer. And those caribou don't calve in an aggregated way. They calve more in a dispersed way, so they basically spread over a large area on the island, and there's no real distinct calving ground per se. But the main characteristic is really that they need that area to be solid in the fall and in the spring, or late in the spring anyway. And so in terms of stressors, basically a little bit the same than for Peary Caribou, but I added disease because from local knowledge there has been in the past decade or so an increase in diseased animal, and so that's potentially a factor, and the fact that they migrate to the mainland, they are more likely to pick up some disease from other herds. But one thing that I wanted to mention, like when we did the latest survey in 2007, there was a barge a tugboat from the sea lift that deliver goods in the communities that was stuck in Cambridge Bay, and they were maintaining that channel to get out of the bay every 12 hours. And it was quite dramatic view of hundreds of caribou. Like we estimated, there was probably overall 1,000 caribou piled up against that channel, and it lasted several days. And finally, the company gave up and decided to winter the tugboat in Cambridge Bay. And the day after, luckily, it was pretty cold. It got pretty cold. But the day after, there was no more caribou to be seen, and trails across everywhere. And so that was quite interesting to see, even if it's very short term, and it's hard to draw a conclusion on the long-term effect on the health of those animals and the survival. But you can imagine in a situation like that, quite far away from a food source, that it can have an impact. Like it blocked them for a long time, and we know we didn't see any drowned animal in the channel, but drowning is also a big factor for mortality. And we found sometime around islands like dozens of dead caribou, either stuck in the ice or dead on the shore because they probably managed to get out but died shortly after getting out of the ice. And with the change in the sea ice patterns and formation and delay in the formation of the sea ice, this can be something that could result in difficulties for that herd to use their whole range, restricting them potentially to Victoria Island, which the question is, does Victoria Island has the carrying capacity to sustain tens of thousands of caribou? In terms of management for Peary Caribou, well, it was listed under the Species at Risk Act, and that implies the requirement for a recovery strategy within a year. Currently, there's ongoing development of territorial management plans, but at the federal level, it hasn't really started yet, to my knowledge. And one thing that will probably delay the management is that it has to respect territorial processes, which include for the Nunavut and the Nunavut land claim agreements that identify a process for the management of wildlife, and those have to be respected in establishing a recovery strategy. And although co-management has the benefit of usually ended up with some people being in agreement on the direction we're going, it usually also takes more time to reach that consensus. So for Dolphin and Union Caribou, it's listed as well, but has special concern, which require a management plan within 3 years. There's been a start on that, and we are trying to establish better harvest and land use monitoring. And there's been some local initiatives to reduce harvest levels, both in NWT and in Nunavut. And we're trying actually to get in Nunavut a workshop going to start on the management plan. And I just wanted to put that for a reflection, because that's something that bothers me a little bit. And there's other examples than caribou, like for example polar bear issue. Well, with the climate change issue, species-specific actions are kind of make me doubt that it's the best approach, because you don't fix the problem that is causing the decline in the case of climate change. You just work on a species without fixing the origin of the problem, potentially, if climate change is identified as one. So it just results in overall poor management and hardship for the communities that during that time are suffering from not being able to use that resources. And one quick example is brown bear in Europe and in France in particular, where they tried even reintroduction programs without fixing the problem. Well, those bears that were reintroduced were dead within a few months. So anyway, just something for reflection and maybe discussion later on how to actually manage species that have a potential threat from climate change, and maybe is it worth it? Just being a little bit the devil's advocate here. And thank you for your time.